are not the first generation in history to be offended by the Bible. I say that because people seem to sometimes assume that we are. Like now we're all enlightened, we're all so smart, we're all so progressive. Now we have the moral sense to be offended. Y'all, the Bible has been offending people for centuries. Y'all, when I was a teenager, the subtitle heading over this section of my King James version of the Bible was simply, David dances naked before the Lord. What is not intriguing for a 7th grader about that? By the way, have y'all noticed that the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel seems to have a flair for the macabre and the risque? We've had stories in 1st and 2nd Samuel of people getting hacked to pieces, stories of David getting trapped in a cave with Saul while Saul, how do you say it, did number 2. Stories about Samuel's ghost coming back from the dead and telling Saul that he's gonna be beheaded and eaten by vultures. Well, today, 2 Samuel 6 is no exception. This is an amazing, amazing story. It's very colorful, and it teaches us some really, really important things about worship. Now, before I begin, let me just acknowledge, worship is a strangely controversial subject in churches. Have you noticed that? I get more constructive criticism on this subject than any other. Some people come to our church because they love the worship. Others leave our church because they don't like it. Strangely, the question of, do I like the worship style, is for some people the most decisive factor in where they choose to go to church. It's more important than what the church believes. It's more important than the preaching content. It's more important than the church's mission or even the community. Now, let me just say right from the outset, one of the things that I love about this church is that you guys come from all kinds of different backgrounds. I'm not sure we have a majority background in this church when it comes to these kind of like denominational thing. We have people that grew up in church context where worship was solemn and reflective. You grew up frequently being told shh when you were in church, right? Some of you like that. Others of you grew up in backgrounds where quiet was never a word that you would associate with church. For a lot of my Pentecostal friends, worship wasn't really good unless somebody passed out. In fact, you can tell who the Pentecostals are here because they're the ones out in the lobby stretching before worship starts because they don't want to pull a hammy while they're worshiping. Weirdly, worship style is a big deal even for those who don't consider themselves Christians at all. I know lots of people here who were drawn to Christ through our worship. A friend of mine who became a Christian here last year, she's brand new to the whole church thing, at least churches like this, and she said our worship service each week was like getting a loud hug from the Lord. Isn't that a great description? A loud hug. God said it should be like that. 1 Corinthians 14:25, Paul says that unbelievers ought to come into our worship service, experience the presence of God through us in our midst, fall on their faces and say, I can't explain it, but surely God is among you. A lot of people I know point to worship as instrumental in their conversion, no pun intended, by the way. On the other hand, I know a lot of non-Christians for whom our worship has been an obstacle. I know of another spiritually curious man who was not a believer, who came here regularly, but always timed his visits so he would get here right when the message started after the worship was over. By the way, I saw a few of you come in here right when I got up, a minute ago. Eventually, this guy accepted Christ, but for a while, our worship was a real obstacle to him. I had a Muslim family that was coming with me for a while that during the worship, the wife would get so bothered she had to get up and leave. All that to say that there is a lot in here for us to think about when it relates to worship. And so let's dive in. Here's what's gonna happen this morning. We're gonna walk through the story, and that's gonna set us up for a couple of really important worship principles we'll get to at the end. But first, we're just gonna work our way through this story, okay? 2 Samuel 6, let's begin in verse 2. David arose and went to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim, the ark of the covenant of raiders of the lost ark fame, that hosted the presence of God. It was basically a gold box, very similar there to what Indiana Jones is holding. It has you'll see the cherubim up on top representing the throne of God. Inside of it were 3 things: a preserved jar of manna representing God's provision. Then there was a copy of the 10 Commandments, or the 10 Commandments that Moses got from God, representing God's rule. And then there was this staff that Aaron led the people with that had budded like it was a living tree branch representing God's miraculous power. That was what was inside the ark. On top of it there, that flat portion is what they call the mercy seat, where once a year, a high priest would offer the blood of a sacrifice as an atonement for sin. David goes down to retrieve the Ark of the Covenant. You say, well, where has it been? Okay, if you recall from our study of 1 Samuel 5, and I know that you do because you're excellent Bible students, you recall that Israel had lost the ark in a battle against the Philistines. They had taken the Ark of the Covenant into battle with them, thinking that it would guarantee them victory like it was a good luck charm when they fought the Philistines, even though they weren't really walking with God at the time. But y'all know, of course, that God will not be manipulated by anybody, and he's not anybody's good luck charm. And so the Israelites lost not only the battle against the Philistines, they lost the ark itself. The Philistines captured it and carried it to the temple of their god, Dagon. The next morning, however, the city was overrun with mice, and all the leaders woke up with tumors, and the statue of Dagon had fallen on his face with his hands chopped off. That seemed like an odd coincidence. So just to be on the safe side, they took the ark to a different Philistine city. Y'all remember this? Y'all look at me like you never heard this before. I literally preached a whole sermon on this, okay? They took it to a different Philistine city, and the exact same thing happened there. So they took it to another city, and this happened a few times, and eventually they're like, we don't want this thing. And so they put it on a new cart, pulled by a couple of young cows with an I'm sorry gift to God of golden images of the tumors accompanying it, which is a really, really strange I'm sorry gift if you ask me. I'm not even sure what that looks like. I don't want to see it. But they put the images of the tumors and the Ark of the Covenant on this new cart, and the young cows who were pulling the new cart miraculously turn in the exact direction of the Jewish tabernacle, and they start to walk the Ark of the Covenant home. When the cows lumbered across the border into Israel, a guy named Shemesh recognizes the ark and takes it into his house. I mean, free ark, right? Who's not going to take that? But then some of the people in his house got curious about the ark, and so they looked inside of it, just like the Germans did in the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie. And they died instantly, also like the Germans did in the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie, though there is no indication that their faces melted off. That said, it doesn't say that their faces didn't melt off either. So it's possible. Bottom line, Shemesh says, this thing's dangerous. I don't want it in my house either. And he sends for some Israelite priest from the next city over to come and get it. And they take it to the house of a guy named Abinadab. Abinadab puts it in one of the guest rooms in his house where it sits undisturbed for 20 years. And visitors to his house are like, hey man, what's in that room? And he's like, I wouldn't go in there if I were you. That was all from 1 Samuel 5. Please tell me you remember this. At least nod your head and pretend like you do, okay? Now, here we are 20 years later, 2 Samuel 6. And David says the Ark of the Covenant belongs at the tabernacle, which brings us to verse 3. And so they carried the Ark of God on a new cart, that's an important detail, and they brought it out of the house of Abinadab. And Uzzah, who was the son of Abinadab, so in other words, the son of the guy that had kept it in his house for 20 years, so Uzzah feels pretty familiar with the Ark of the Covenant, was the one driving the new cart. Verse 5, and David and all the house of Israel were making merry before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and the Hammond B3 organ and the electric guitars and the kazoo and all these other instruments. They are having a flat out praise palooza. Verse 6, when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled. And Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God to steady it. No, he didn't want it to fall on the ground. Verse 7, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error. The Hebrew word there for error implies irreverence, a casualness, an overfamiliarity. And the Lord struck him down because of his irreverence, and Uzzah died right there beside the ark of God. Now watch this next verse. And David was angry because the Lord had burst forth against Uzzah. Y'all, one of the things I love about the Bible is how honest it is. David was offended by God. David was like, come on, God. He was trying to do you a favor. Listen, I want to say this gently but very clearly. We are not the first generation in history to be offended by the Bible. I say that because people seem to sometimes assume that we are. Like now we're all enlightened, we're all so smart, we're all so progressive. Now we have the moral sense to be offended. Y'all, the Bible has been offending people for centuries. Even some of its writers like David. Y'all, if the requirement for belief would be that nothing in the Bible offended you, I would not be a Christian. Neither would David. Like David, there are things in this book that honestly, they bother me, they confuse me, and sometimes make me mad. But I've learned to trust God despite those things, because I figure if God is God and I'm not God, then there's a lot of things about my thinking that are gonna have to shift over the years. Look at this next verse, verse 9. And David was afraid. David was afraid of the Lord on that day. And he said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? It's too dangerous. So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. David, in other words, left the ark of God in the home of man who was not even a Hebrew. If you are taking notes, here's what we're going to see today in this story. Number one, we're going to see the problem of God's presence. Then we're going to see number two, the ark as God's answer to that problem. And then we're going to see number three, our only logical response to that answer. Here we go. Number one, the problem of God's presence. Let's talk for a minute about what actually happened to Uzzah. You say, I don't get it. What was Uzzah supposed to do? Just watch it tumble onto the ground? I mean, he was trying to do God a favor and keep the ark from getting dirty. At the very least, you would probably say, the punishment feels a little bit more severe than the crime. In fact, if I asked you to raise your hands this morning, if you think that this punishment is more severe than the crime was, I bet 99.8% of you would put your hand up, and the 0.2% of you that didn't would be lying. And I get that, y'all, I really do. But here's the thing, and this is going to be hard for some of you. The whole point of this story, maybe the whole point of the Old Testament, is that the punishment was not more severe than the crime. Here is why. First, God had given very specific instructions in Exodus 25 about how the ark was to be carried just to avoid a situation like this. It had been constructed with little loops on the side so that you would run poles through it and you would carry it that way, a little special covering to go over it so that nobody would accidentally touch it. The Israelites chose to ignore those biblical instructions and just do it their way. In fact, did you notice that they were transporting it on a new cart? Remember, I kind of called your attention to that. Where did they learn that technique from? From the Philistines. They just decided that the Philistine way is easier. Y'all listen, you don't get to decide the way that you worship God. I know that's difficult for a 21st century American to hear because you're like, it's my way, this is who I am, this is what I want to be, this is what I prefer. You don't get to make that choice. God decides those things. And you and I have to heed his word. The second and bigger issue was this. Uzzah was totally unaware of his own sinfulness. Uzzah saw the ark about to touch the ground, and Uzzah thought, I should keep the ark from touching the ground because the ground is dirty. But Uzzah doesn't realize that his hand is far more filthy than anything on earth. As the late R.C. Sproul said, the dirt had never rebelled against the authority of God. Only sinful man had done that. It wasn't the dirt on the ground that would defile the ark, it was the touch of man that would. You see, our sin makes us infinitely more offensive to the holiness of God than the filthiest filth on the planet. You say, well, I'm not that sinful. I know I'm not perfect, of course, but compared to other people, I'm a pretty good person. Yeah, but see, that's because you're not thinking about how holy God is. God is of such purity that imperfection is more revolting to him than any kind of bacteria is to you. Imagine you were drinking, for example, a glass of milk. And I told you as you were on your second gulp that a few droplets of some lethal virus, or maybe just urine, a few drops of urine are mixed into it. You don't go, well, at least it's 99% pure. No, at that point, the whole thing for you is defiled and you want to vomit. Multiply that emotion times 1,000,000,000, and maybe you're getting close to God's revulsion at our sin. The prophet Haggai said that God was of such pure eyes that he could not even behold evil or look upon wickedness. Coming into God's presence with sin on you would be like a piece of tissue paper trying to land on the surface of the sun. Sometimes, like Uzzah, we seem blissfully unaware of this. You can hear that, and we sing these glib little songs like, Lord, I want to see your face. Y'all realize that if God suddenly answered that prayer and ripped the roof off this place and looked down on us, a bunch of us might die. Y'all realize that, right? But see, that brings up a question, doesn't it? Uzzah touched the ark and he died. Here's a question. How many of you are holding the Bible right now? Should be all of you, by the way. How many of you are holding the Bible? You're touching the word of God. Why are you still alive? Why am I still alive? That's a great question, and that's number two. The ark as God's answer. If the ark presents us with the problem of God's presence, it also gives us God's answer. Look at verse 11. And so the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. They just left it there 3 months because they were afraid of it. Now watch this. The Lord, though, blessed Obed-Edom and all of his household. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. It was like God was sending a message to David that his intention was to bless. David's faith is rekindled. And so David sends for the ark. David goes down and brings the ark of God up from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. He brought it to the capital. Verse 13, and when those, watch this, who bore the ark of the Lord, you see that? Those who bore means the ark is now being carried by people, just like Exodus commanded. When Uzzah was carrying it, he was doing it in the Philistine way, just ignoring God's instructions. Now they're doing it God's way. Verse 13, and when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he, David, sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. Every 6 steps, 6 is the number of man, they made a sacrifice. God had provided a way for his people to be in his presence with safety, and that was through sacrifice. Like I said, the most important feature of the ark was a mercy seat on the top where the high priest once a year would sprinkle the blood of a sacrifice. You know, in our sanitized world, we tend to think of animal sacrifices like this as traditional and quaint. Y'all, they are not. I have seen one. I've been live in person for one. They are, in a word, horrible. They are bloody. They are difficult to watch. It is supposed to be revolting to you. You are not supposed to get used to it. Because see, that lamb is dying for their sin. A death like Uzzah's is being reenacted at each sacrifice. And see, friend, that's the gospel. Because Jesus one day would come like one of these lambs. It wouldn't take every 6 steps. He would do it one time, once for all, and he would die the death of Uzzah once for all in our place. He was struck down for our irreverence. He was struck down for our filthiness in the presence of God. On the cross, all the wrath of God directed at our sin was absorbed into his body. Tony Evans tells the story, true story, of a man who was out hiking with his wife one afternoon in the middle of an open field when they got caught in a terrible hailstorm. Now, y'all, this was a massive hailstorm, one of those rare storms where the hail is as large as baseballs. The man realized that if he didn't do something quickly, his wife was gonna get severely hurt. So he draped himself over his wife, covering her with his own body and his jacket so that the hailstones would hit him instead of her. He thought the hailstorm would only last for a few seconds the way they typically do, but the hailstones seemed to just get bigger and bigger and come down harder and harder. After a couple of minutes, his ears were bleeding along with several spots on his head. His face was bruised. His arms had bruises on them. He tried to get to cover, but he was so weakened by the onslaught that he finally just collapsed over his wife, only able to shield her from the danger as she lay underneath him. After a few minutes, the storm finally ceased, for the hailstones had taken their toll. Now, they both survived, but he was left with scars from head to foot where the balls, the hailstones, had battered away to him, scars that remain to this day. He carries around with him visible reminders of the day that he saved his wife. On the local newscast later, the man's wife was asked how she felt about their experience, and all she said, well, every time I see the scars, I love him more. Every time I see the scars, I love him more. Did y'all know that according to the book of Revelation, there will only be one person in heaven with scars? All the scars of your pain will be taken away. You and I will have perfected bodies, and Jesus will have wiped away every tear, but Jesus will permanently have holes in his hands and his feet and one on his side. Those scars will be our eternal reminder that the only reason we're there is because he stood between the wrath of God and the judgment headed our way. He covered us with his love and kept the hailstones of judgment from hitting us. He died the death of Uzzah in my place. And when we see the scars, it'll make us love him more. And see, that leads me to number 3, our only logical response. Verse 14, and David danced before the Lord with all of his might. What else do you do before a God who saved your life like that, who was struck down in your place? David was wearing a linen ephod. Some translations say naked there. That's where we get the idea from. But Hebrew scholars tell us that the phrase really means David stripped down to his underwear, which for a Jewish man consisted of a linen ephod that they wore under their robes. It's the Hebrew version of adult underoos. All right? I'm actually wearing one right now. It's quite comfortable. I'm just kidding. Okay, that's not true. Verse 15. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting. And with the sound of the horn, watch this, verse 16, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and he distributed among all the peoples, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his own house. We're gonna come back to that. But first, let me finish the story, verse 20. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, oh, how the king of Israel honored himself today. Just dripping with sarcasm. Uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants and his female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. In other words, David, you look like a fool. You didn't look like a king. Your behavior doesn't befit a king. You're acting more like somebody from the peasant class. We're royal. That's not how we're supposed to act. Verse 21, David said to Michal, no, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as a prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will make merry before the Lord. Indeed, I will make myself even more contemptible. Some translations say undignified there. I will make myself even more undignified than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by those female servants of whom you have spoken, by them, they'll actually hold me in honor for what I'm doing. Let me translate all that for you, if I could. David said, Michal, God chose me when I was nothing. And now that I'm something, I'm gonna show everybody else that it's not because of something special about me. It's because of something special that God has done for me. Y'all remember Michal was King Saul's daughter. Her dad's problem, you remember, was that he always cared about what everybody else thought about him. And sadly, Michal has taken on that trait from her daddy, which kids often do. She's only thinking about what everybody else is thinking about her and David. For her, it is all about appearances. David says, I don't care what people think about me. In fact, I don't want them to think about me at all. I want them to think about him. And by the way, he says to Michal, as for those female servants in whose eyes you seem to be so worried about my reputation, when they see my exuberance before the Lord, when they see that I'm nothing before the Lord and that he is my everything, then they're gonna see that there really is no difference in them and me. They'll forget that I'm a king and they're peasants, and they will learn that they have the same access to God that I do. They have the same treasure in him that I do. They got the same promises in him I do. They can hope in him like I do, and that'll bring them the same joy that I have, and they'll learn to thank God for me. In his words to Michal, David gives us the essence of worship. Here's my favorite short definition of worship. Worship means putting the worthiness of God on display. That's all it is. In fact, we get the word worship in English from worth plus ship. When you are worshiping, you are declaring the quality of worthiness in something to other people. You're worshiping it, showing this is worthy. So here is my question for you. You ready? What is your worship? Tell others about the value of God to you.
At Summit Life, our mission is simple but profound: to take people deeper into the gospel and to advance it wider across the world. With your support, we are able to meet people right where they are. Join us today as a monthly gospel partner. Your ongoing gift supports our radio, TV, and digital ministries, plus print resources. As a thank you, we'll send you Pastor J.D.'s signature book, Gospel. This book cuts through religious superficiality, revealing the revolutionary truth of God's acceptance of us in Christ. Become a gospel partner today. Visit jdgreer.com or call 866-335-5220. Together, let's bring God's healing and truth to the world.